Steven Pifer is a senior fellow with the Brookings Institution. He speaks and publishes widely on arms control, Russia, Ukraine. A retired Foreign Service officer, Ambassador Pifer has served as US Ambassador to Ukraine, in the White House, on the National Security Council, and at the US embassies in Warsaw, Moscow, and London. Ambassador Pifer, welcome to WorldDenver Talks.
Thank you for having me.
There's so much going on in your area, it's hard to know where to begin, but let's begin with Vladimir Putin. Some experts argue that Putin's actions in Ukraine were provoked by U.S. and European actions. Would you agree with that characterization?
Well, I would agree that that's Vladimir Putin's narrative. When he talks about NATO enlargement, he sees this as driven by the West and specifically aimed at hemming in Russia. But I don't think that that really reflects the reality. In the mid-1990s, when I was on the National Security Council staff, working for President Clinton, at that time we were looking at NATO enlargement. But it wasn't something that the United States said, let's push enlargement. It really was demand-driven, as you had countries like Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic, who had emerged from 40 years of Soviet domination during the Cold War, and they basically were making the argument, we want to be full members of Europe, we want to be in the European Union, we want to be in NATO. Part of that NATO part reflected their lingering distrust about Russia, understandable given the 40-year history. But it was very hard for us on the West to say, if Poland makes the same political and economic reforms and democratic reforms, how do you say no? But President Clinton was also very focused on the idea that as we move down the enlargement track, there needs to be a parallel track to try to have NATO engage Russia. And the idea here was that could we build a relationship with Russia that would be so positive, so cooperative, that Moscow, in essence, wouldn't worry about enlargement. And so you had things like in 1997, there was actually an agreement between NATO and Russia before NATO invited the first new countries to join the alliance. And NATO said things like, in this envisioned security environment, there would be no permanent station of substantial combat forces on the territory of new NATO members, designed to signal the Russians that there would not be any advance of NATO military forces towards the east. So I think NATO went a long way to try to address Russian concerns. We probably underestimated the antipathy that the Russians felt towards NATO and towards NATO enlargement. But again, I think Vladimir Putin has a very different narrative, and in his narrative, this was something that NATO was provoked. I don't think we're going to find a way to change that.
And Putin has been saying for a long time that if you enlarge NATO, if the EU moves eastward, that would be perceived by him as a provocation.
I can understand his concern about NATO, and I think within the alliance that's well understood. But increasingly over the last several years, we've seen that concern also extends to the European Union. And the European Union is not a military organization, it's a political economic organization. But there is a basic question here, and it applies very much now in the case of Ukraine. Russia may have concerns about where Ukraine's going. And there certainly are Russian interests in Ukraine. But does that give Russia the right to dictate to Ukraine, an independent sovereign country, its foreign policy choices? And at the end of the day, if Ukraine decides that it wants to draw closer to the European Union, I would argue that should be a choice for the Ukrainians to make.
Some of the critics of U.S. policy point to Cuba as an example of where the Soviets moved into what was perceived as an American sphere of influence, and we reacted very strongly to that. Is that a legitimate comparison?
Well, maybe, but there's a bit of a stretch. I mean, in 1962, when we had the Cuban Missile Crisis, it was not only that the Soviets had moved into Cuba, but they were putting in medium-range missiles with nuclear warheads that could target 2/3 of the United States. And certainly, I mean, actually, in 1997, NATO said, again, trying to reassure the Russians that there was no plan, no requirement, no intention to deploy nuclear weapons on the territory of any new members. So I think NATO has been sensitive to the idea that while it was enlarging, not to take steps that would not be seen by the Russians as militarily provocative. Now that's changed in the last 4 or 5 months. You have NATO doing some things militarily because of concerns about Russia that are designed to reassure those allies closer to Russia, but also to underscore a red line to the Russians that as NATO members, those countries are going to be defended.
Now, does the fact that the West did not intervene to help the Ukrainians, militarily, does that sort of signal that Ukraine is not of great strategic significance?
Well, I think when you look at it, and from the beginning of this crisis, and the crisis which was from November of last year up into February was an internal Ukrainian crisis, since the end of February that's been a Ukrainian-Russian crisis. And you've seen, I think, a series of Russian escalations over the last 5 months to sow some chaos and destabilize Ukraine. I think it's pretty clear that the West is not going to go to war with Russia over Ukraine. And that's understood in Moscow. It's also understood in Kyiv, which is important because you don't want the Ukrainians to miscalculate. And I'd probably say, too, that Vladimir Putin cares more about losing Ukraine than the West cares about pulling Ukraine towards the West. I had a long-term contact say, Vladimir Putin has succeeded in realizing the dream of centuries of Ukrainian nationalists. He's forged a Ukrainian national identity. And there's a worrisome part about that, I think, is it's infused now with a very strong Russian, anti-Russian element, which I don't think was there before. But as one Ukrainian told me, he said, look, the people here, they look and they say it's not just Vladimir Putin, it's the Russian people are not opposing, they're not speaking out of this. Now, maybe the demonstrations which took place on September 21 in Moscow, where 25,000 people in Moscow came out to protest against the war, maybe that will change that. But there really, I think, is this sense now in Ukraine of national identity and this pushback against Russia.
So is Putin going to stop at Ukraine? I mean, there are other areas, other enclaves of Russian speakers and Russian citizens throughout the region. Is he going to stop there?
We don't know. And I think this is one of the things that has countries around Russia more nervous now. Over the last couple of years, but Mr. Putin's talked about this in fairly sharp terms in the last couple of months, is this idea that Russia has a right to defend ethnic Russians or Russian speakers wherever they're located and regardless of their nationality. So once in I guess it was May, when Mr. Putin finally admitted that yes, it had been the Russian army, not local militia, that had taken over Crimea, his justification was we had to protect ethnic Russians, even though there was no visible threat to the ethnic Russians in Crimea. But if you're a country like Estonia and Latvia, where a quarter of your population is ethnic Russian, you now begin to pay attention to what Mr. Putin's saying, and you see what happened in Ukraine and say, are we next on this? And so those countries, I think, are much more nervous now about Russia than they were, say, a year ago. And Estonia and Latvia matter to us in a way. It's a different degree than Ukraine because they are members of NATO. And under Article 5, as an ally, we are committed to consider an attack on them the same as an attack on the United States.
How do you see the role of social media in this?
There's been a lot of Russian denials, for example, about whether the Russian military has been acting against or in Ukraine. And it gets to the point where you had NATO, the Ukrainian government, the United States government, all saying that Russian forces in June and July were actually firing into Ukraine. And that in August, hard evidence, they said that there was that Russian military forces, regular army units were operating in Ukraine. Well, you can verify this on social media. Back in July, one young Russian soldier, I'm sure he's been disciplined since then, posts some selfies and pictures of his artillery unit and says, we're down here on the Ukrainian border and we spent all last night shelling Ukraine. There was pictures that were posted in Ukraine, and this was a time when the Russian government was saying, we have not given any weapons to the Ukrainians, we have no forces in Ukraine. But you had the separatists had tanks. And the story was, well, they've probably stolen the tanks from the Ukrainian army. But you have pictures posted of the tanks, and you look at the tank and you say, wait, that tank has reactive armor that's not in the Ukrainian inventory. The only country that has that kind of armor is the Russian military. One time, and I think it was probably some Russians, they were on a picnic. This is in maybe June. And all of a sudden, look over there, and they film what looked to be a series, it's a rocket salvo being fired in a certain direction. They post this on the website, and I think it was not posted with the intention of saying our army's fighting against Ukraine. It was, we were out and we saw this really interesting thing. Somebody then took that film, geospatially located it using Google Earth, found the location and said, here's the lake in the foreground, here's the tree line, they match exactly, here's where this place is. It's about 4 miles from the Ukrainian border, and by the direction, those are rockets being fired into Ukraine. So social media, it's interesting for us to watch because we can track things. On that horrible day in July when the Malaysian airliner was shot down, we did a blog at Brookings thinking we're pretty sure it was done by the Ukrainian separatists because there's a post that we found. It was by the guy who called himself the defense minister of the so-called Donetsk People's Republic. And he said, our surface-to-air missile forces shot down a Ukrainian Antonov 26 airplane. That'll teach people to stay out of airspace. Well, there was no record of an Antonov 26 being shot down that day, no wreckage. but the time and the location matched exactly the shoot down of the Malaysian airliner.